Welcome back to Mr. Cursed. You know those mountains that look peaceful during the day? Well, wait until you hear what comes out at night. I've collected 8 encounters from the Appalachian wilderness, and honestly, some of these kept me up last night. We're talking about pale figures walking on 2 legs, voices that mimic your family, and things that study humans like we're the animals. Quick favor, smash that subscribe button and hit like. Your support means everything. Also, comment where you're watching from. I love seeing you guys from all over the world. Ready to hear what's hiding in those mountains? Let's go. I'm 29 years old and work as a radio technician for the State Emergency Services. Most of my job involves maintaining equipment in towers scattered across West Virginia's mountains. But that October night in '87, I was just supposed to be monitoring the emergency frequencies from home. My little apartment in Charleston had all the gear I needed: scanners, recording equipment, backup radios, since I was part of the Volunteer Emergency Response Network. Honestly, it was usually pretty quiet work. Truckers calling in accidents, hikers needing rescue, the occasional domestic dispute that sheriff's deputies had to handle. Nothing that would keep me up at night, you know? But October 30th, 1987 was different. I still have the recordings somewhere in my basement, though I don't listen to them much anymore. I remember I was eating leftover pizza and half watching some late movie when the first call came through around 9 p.m. WKVL Mountain Radio was the main emergency coordinator for Raleigh County, and their dispatcher sounded confused more than anything else. All units were getting reports of large wildlife blocking roads throughout the mountain region. Standard enough, bears wander onto highways all the time, especially in fall when they're looking for food before winter. I figured it would be resolved in an hour or two. But then Sheriff Coleman came on the radio, and his voice had this edge to it I'd never heard before. Dispatch, these aren't normal animals. Witnesses describe creatures that walk upright but aren't human. I sat up straighter, turned the volume up. Coleman had been sheriff for maybe 15 years at that point, and he wasn't the type to get spooked by shadows or mistake a person in dark clothes for something else. That's when Mike Kowalski at WKVL made the decision that probably saved a lot of lives that night. This is Mike Kowalski at WKVL, folks. We're switching to emergency broadcast mode due to unusual wildlife activity. Mike was this old-school DJ who'd been working mountain radio since the 60 seconds. He knew every hollow, every family, every road in 3 counties. If Mike thought something was serious enough to break normal programming, it was serious. The first caller was Earl from Blackwater Ridge, and I could hear the genuine fear in his voice even through the static. "Mike, something just walked past my house that was 8 feet tall and pale as death. It had arms that hung down to its knees and moved like it was studying everything, checking my fence posts and mailbox." Earl's voice was shaking, but he was trying to stay calm, trying to describe exactly what he'd seen. Mike tried to rationalize it. You could hear him grasping for normal explanations. "Earl, you sure it wasn't just a bear standing up? Sometimes shadows can play tricks in the evening light." But Earl cut him off. "Mike, this thing looked right at me through my window and tilted its head like it was trying to figure out what I was." That's when I started recording everything. Something in Earl's voice told me this wasn't going to be a normal night. The reports kept coming. 7 different locations, all describing the same type of creature. Betty from Slab Fork called in around 10 p.m., said there were 3 of them in her yard, just standing there watching her house. They're not threatening, just observing, like they're trying to understand how humans live. When Mike suggested making noise to scare them off, Betty laughed, not a happy laugh. "Mike, I banged pots and pans, and they just tilted their heads in unison like they were learning about human behavior." That's when I knew we were dealing with something that had never been reported before. At least not officially. I'd been working emergency services for 6 years, and you hear all kinds of calls, people seeing lights in the sky, hearing voices in the woods, finding tracks they can't identify. But this was different. These were multiple witnesses across multiple counties, all describing the same behavior patterns. Dr. Sarah Chen from WVU's anthropology department called in around 11 p.m., and her voice was excited, like she'd been waiting her whole career for this moment. These descriptions match historical accounts going back 150 years, entities that observe human settlements. She explained that these things weren't random encounters. They were territorial beings that had been coexisting with humans by maintaining what she called observation boundaries. Maria Santos, who delivered mail up in the hollows, confirmed what Dr. Chen was saying. I've seen the stone markers for years. I always thought they were just mountain folk superstitions, but now I realize they were territorial markers. The entities seem to know my mail route. They watch me from the tree line but never interfere with my work. By midnight, Ranger Martinez was reporting over 50 entities throughout Daniel Boone National Forest, all maintaining specific distances from human structures. They weren't attacking or threatening anyone. They were conducting some kind of survey, measuring human expansion into their traditional territory. That's when Elder Mary Blackhorse from the Cherokee Nation called in, and everything started making sense. Her grandmother had told her about the Watchers beings that had always been there, studying how humans change the land, making sure we don't expand too aggressively. Tonight they're showing themselves because human development has reached some kind of threshold, Mary explained. Around 1 a.m., the entities started withdrawing, but they left clear territorial markers, stone cairns, arrangements of sticks, red cloth tied to fence posts. Bill Mitchell, a surveyor, noticed that these markers matched old Cherokee land agreements, like the entities were enforcing original territorial boundaries from before white settlement. By dawn on Halloween morning, it was over. The mountains were quiet again. WKVL went back to regular programming, though Mike's voice was different for weeks afterward. Dr. Chen published a paper about it the following year, though most academics dismissed it as mass hysteria. But here's the thing that still bothers me, looking back now. Following that broadcast, Raleigh County quietly established something called the Mountain Coexistence Protocol. They started requiring environmental impact studies for all mountain development, and they began recognizing what they called traditional territorial boundaries. Most people assumed it was just new environmental regulations, but I knew better. I transferred to a desk job in Charleston 6 months later. Haven't done field work in the mountains since. Sometimes I'll drive up there for hiking or fishing, but I always stick to the main trails, the well-marked areas. And I always pay attention to stone cairns and red cloth markers, because I've learned that some territories in these mountains have been claimed for a lot longer than we realized. And every October 30th, I still monitor the emergency frequencies, just in case those watchers decide it's time for another territorial assessment. To this day, I wonder how many other places have these kinds of agreements we don't know about. I'm 43 years old, and I run a small auto repair shop in Beckley, West Virginia. Been fixing cars most of my adult life, got grease under my fingernails that'll probably never come out. My grandfather Ezra passed away 3 months ago, and honestly, I didn't think much would come of it. We weren't particularly close. He lived up in the mountains, kept to himself mostly. But when lawyer Jenkins called me that October afternoon while I was replacing brake pads on a rusted-out Chevy, everything changed. Turns out I'd inherited 500 acres of mountain land I'd never even seen, plus a sealed wooden box with Blood Moon only carved into the lid. That should have been my first warning. Growing up, I always wondered how our family managed to stay afloat financially. My grandfather somehow afforded expensive medical treatments. My dad built a successful business from nothing, and we never seemed to struggle like other mountain families. Dad always said we Hartleys had good instincts for opportunities, but he never explained what he meant by that. When I drove up to the property on October 25th, following a dirt road that wasn't on any GPS, I started to understand there was more to our family's story than anyone had told me. The land was beautiful in that wild Appalachian way. Dense forest, rocky outcroppings, views that stretched for miles. But there were things that didn't feel right. Fresh stone cairns, arranged in perfect geometric patterns along what seemed to be property lines. Red cloth strips tied to trees with mathematical precision, like someone was maintaining ancient boundary markers. And that sealed box from Granddad's house, when I finally opened it that evening in my motel room, I found journals dating back generations, all documenting encounters with something they called the Ridgewalker. According to the journals, this thing had claimed the mountain ridge as its territory back in the early 1800s. My great-great-grandfather Samuel had been the first to encounter it, an 8-foot-tall pale creature with arms that hung past its knees and a head that tilted at impossible angles. Instead of running or fighting, Samuel had somehow negotiated a deal. The creature would allow our family to prosper in exchange for what the journal called annual tribute. Every blood moon in October, one family member had to spend the night on the ridge, allowing the entity to study them. The more I read, the clearer it became that this wasn't some supernatural curse or demon. The Ridgewalker was something ancient that had existed alongside humanity, territorial and intelligent, studying human behavior and development across multiple generations. In exchange for peaceful coexistence, it guided our family toward profitable opportunities for mineral deposits, valuable timber, good farmland. Every male Hartley was apparently born with enhanced intuition for finding valuable resources, an ability passed down through the entity's influence. My mechanical skills. My ability to diagnose engine problems that stumped other mechanics, EOT, according to these journals, that wasn't entirely natural. The entity enhanced human pattern recognition abilities. My grandfather had used this knowledge to make smart investments in automotive parts during the post-war boom. My father had built his successful business with an uncanny ability to predict which repairs would be needed before they broke down completely. But October 30th was coming, and there was a blood moon rising. I spent the 26th exploring the ridge, finding evidence everywhere once I knew what to look for. Handprints with 4 fingers pressed into stone. Cave paintings showing the entity's evolution over centuries, learning to walk upright. Developing tool use. Adapting its hunting methods. The creature had been using our mountain as an observation post for over 200 years, studying human expansion into its territory through our family. The journals described it, fascination with mechanical devices. Watches, engines, electronic equipment, ECM. It would study these items for hours, apparently understanding their function through direct observation. It had been tracking human technological progress through us, using our family as a window into civilization's advancement. On October 30th, as the blood moon began rising, I felt something I can only describe as a compulsion. Not magical or mystical, more like when you know you need to check on something important, that nagging feeling that won't go away. I found myself hiking up to a stone circle that had been maintained by my family for 2 centuries. The Ridgewalker was waiting. It was exactly as the journals described, pale, elongated, with gray, waxy skin and joints that bent in ways human anatomy couldn't. Its black eyes showed obvious intelligence as it approached with careful, deliberate movements. No aggression, but I could feel it studying me the way I might examine a particularly complex engine problem. When it placed its 4-fingered hands on my head, I experienced visions of every Hartley man who had undergone this process. I saw the entity's growing understanding of human development, watched it learn about our tools, our technology, our ways of thinking. But this time was different. Instead of simply observing, the Ridgewalker attempted to communicate directly. Through clicking sounds combined with mimicked human speech, high MD, voices it had learned from generations of my family, it revealed that it wanted to modify our agreement. Human technology was advancing too rapidly for passive observation. It needed a more active partnership with humans who understood both technology and mountain survival. The creature showed me hidden mineral deposits, sustainable harvesting techniques, knowledge accumulated over centuries of watching the mountain's ecosystem. We developed a communication system, combining mechanical signals with its natural clicking language. It wasn't asking for worship or sacrifice today. It wanted cooperation between species sharing the same territory. That was 6 months ago. I still run my garage in Beckley, but I've also started a consulting business, helping environmental groups and mining companies develop sustainable practices. I use knowledge from both human technology and ancient mountain wisdom. The Ridgewalker visits my garage regularly, usually late at night when I'm working alone, studying new automotive developments. People in town think I've gotten lucky with some investment opportunities, finding valuable scrap metal and rare car parts. They don't know about my partner, who's been living on that ridge longer than West Virginia has been a state. We're working together now to ensure that progress doesn't destroy the delicate balance between civilization and whatever else calls these mountains home. I never told anyone about this until now, and I probably shouldn't be telling you. But sometimes, when I'm working on a particularly stubborn engine problem, I'll hear that familiar clicking sound from the back of my shop. And somehow, I always figure out exactly what needs fixing. I'm 62 years old, and I spent 30 years delivering mail to the families scattered through these West Virginia mountains. After I retired from the post office last year, I figured I'd finally tackle the one job I'd been putting off, cleaning out Mama's old house up in Copper Hollow. She'd been gone 2 years, and I just couldn't bring myself to deal with it until now. The place had been sitting empty, and honestly, I was dreading going through all her things. But Halloween seemed like as good a day as any to face it. I'd driven past the turnoff to Copper Hollow Road thousands of times during my mail route, but I'd never actually delivered up there. The families that lived deeper in the hollow always came down to the main road to get their mail from the cluster boxes. Looking back now, I think there might have been a reason for that. The drive up that winding dirt road felt longer than it should have. I brought Daddy's old film camera with me, one of those heavy 35mm models from the 70s, to document everything for the insurance company. I'm not much for technology, but I know how to work that old camera, and I figured I'd need pictures of Mama's antiques and furniture before I started hauling things out. The October afternoon was warm, but something felt off the moment I pulled into the overgrown driveway. Too quiet, maybe. In all my years carrying mail through these mountains, I'd gotten used to the constant background noise. Birds chattering, insects buzzing, wind moving through the trees. But standing there next to my car, I couldn't hear any of that. Just this heavy, thick silence that made my ears feel stuffed up. I found the spare key where Mama always kept it, under the loose board on the porch steps. The house smelled like old wood and dust, but underneath that was something else, something damp and earthy that reminded me of turning over rocks in the garden. All the furniture was still covered in sheets, looking like ghosts in the dim light filtering through the dirty windows. That's when I noticed the rock piles. Someone had built little towers of stones all around the property. Perfect little cairns, each one about knee-high, with pieces of bark laid on top. The bark had symbols carved into it, not letters or anything I recognized, just geometric shapes that hurt to look at for too long. Triangles inside circles, spirals that seemed to move if you stared at them. I walked the perimeter of the house and counted 12 of these stone markers, placed in a perfect circle around the building. Between some of the trees, red cloth strips had been tied to branches, fluttering in a breeze I couldn't feel. The whole setup looked deliberate, like someone was marking territory. My hands were shaking a little as I started taking pictures. Daddy's camera had always been reliable, but it was acting strange. The viewfinder kept showing double images, and the light meter was jumping around like it couldn't decide what it was looking at. I thought maybe the battery was dying, but when I changed it out for a fresh one, the same thing kept happening. I decided to photograph each room systematically, starting with the living room. That's when I heard the footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps circling the house. But they were wrong somehow. Too evenly spaced, like someone was counting out the rhythm. Step, step, step. Always the same interval, never speeding up or slowing down. I went to the window and pressed my face against the glass, trying to see who was out there. That's when I saw the handprints. 4-fingered handprints pressed against the outside of the window, right at eye level. The palms were too long, and the fingers were stretched out like someone had tried to copy what a human hand looked like, but got the proportions wrong. The prints were still wet, leaving streaks on the old glass. I backed away from the window, my heart hammering in my chest. The footsteps had stopped, but now I could hear something else. A sound like fabric rustling or papers being shuffled. It was coming from deeper in the house. I followed the sound to Mama's bedroom, camera clutched in my sweaty hands. The room looked normal at first, just furniture under dust covers. But then I noticed that items from my purse were scattered across the bed in perfect geometric patterns. My wallet, my car keys, my reading glasses, all arranged in spirals and triangles that matched the symbols I'd seen carved into the bark outside. I know I hadn't taken those things out of my purse. I hadn't even been in this room yet. The camera started clicking on its own, the shutter firing rapidly, like someone else was pressing the button. I tried to stop it, but my hands wouldn't respond. Through the viewfinder, I could see something moving in the corner of the room, something tall and pale that seemed to bend in ways that made my eyes water. Then I lost time. The next thing I remember clearly was standing in my car in the driveway, engine running, with the sun setting behind the mountains. My camera was sitting on the passenger seat, and the film counter showed I'd used up the entire roll. But I only remembered taking maybe 6 or 7 pictures. I drove straight to the photo lab in town and paid extra for 1 hour developing. When I got those pictures back, I understood why I'd lost those hours. Every single photograph showed the same thing. Me, standing in different rooms of the house, but I wasn't alone. Behind me in each picture was a tall, gray figure with arms that hung past its knees and a head tilted at an angle that would snap a human neck. Its skin looked waxy and stretched too tight over bones that bent wrong. But what terrified me most was what the pictures showed me doing. In every shot, I was handing the creature something. My car keys, my wallet, pieces of my clothing, like I was teaching it about human possessions, showing it how we use these objects. The thing's face was wrong in every way possible. Too narrow, with features that seemed to slide around when I looked at different photos. But its eyes were fixed on me with the kind of focus you see in children when they're learning something new. In the final photograph, the creature was holding up 4 fingers while I held up 5, like it was trying to learn to count. I never went back to that house. I called my cousin Tommy and told him if he wanted any of Mama's things, he could go get them himself. I didn't tell him why, but I did some research at the library. Turns out, our family wasn't the first to live on that land. County records show a Cherokee family owned it back in the 1842, but they abandoned it suddenly in 1847. The records mention their children reporting encounters with something not of this world that lived in the hollow and studied their people. Every family that's lived on that land since has reported the same thing. Children talking to imaginary friends that match the same description. Tall, gray, wrong proportions. Always watching, always learning. Looking through my childhood memories, I remember talking to someone at the edge of the woods when I was little. Mama would find me out there having conversations with empty air. I told her about the tall man who stood wrong and wanted me to play copying games with him. I think it recognized me. After all these years, it remembered the little girl who used to teach it things, and it wanted to learn what she'd become as an adult. I'm writing this at the Beckley Public Library because I moved out of the county entirely. I found those same red cloth strips tied to trees around my apartment building last month, and fresh stone cairns in my backyard. My car keys were buried 6 inches deep in the flower bed, arranged in a circle with small animal bones. It's not done studying me, and I don't think it ever will be. The photos are getting worse. Last week, I found new pictures in my camera that I didn't take. They show the creature wearing pieces of my clothing, trying to copy how humans dress. In the most recent one, it's standing in what looks like my childhood bedroom, but the proportions are all wrong, like it's trying to rebuild the room from memory. I don't sleep well anymore. Every night I hear those slow, measured footsteps circling whatever building I'm in. Always the same rhythm, always counting. People need to know what's claiming territory up in Copper Hollow. It's not evil, exactly, just curious. But its curiosity isn't something human minds are meant to handle. And it's still out there, still watching, still learning about us. Still waiting for the next family with children to move on to its land. I just hope nobody else is foolish enough to go back. I'm 22 years old, and I deliver pizzas for a living, which isn't exactly where I thought I'd be after high school, but life has a way of throwing curveballs at you. I was saving up for trade school, wanted to learn electrical work like my dad, and living in a tiny apartment above Murphy's Diner in Blackwater, West Virginia. The money was okay during the week, but Halloween night in 2023, they offered security guards quadruple pay to work the abandoned processing plant on the edge of town. That kind of money would cover 2 months of my trade school applications. So when Jake from the IGA and Carla from the diner said they were doing it too, I figured it couldn't be that bad. Looking back now, I should have asked myself why they needed to pay that much just to get 3 people to sit in a building for 8 hours. Jake was 38 and managed the grocery store, but his little girl needed surgery for something with her heart, and insurance wasn't covering all of it. Carla was 45, worked the morning shift at Murphy's cooking breakfast, and was taking care of her mom who had dementia. We all needed the money, which is probably why none of us asked too many questions when the security company guy gave us the briefing. He kept calling it territorial wildlife and mentioned that the fence was 12 feet high with razor wire, but he said it like that was normal for an abandoned chemical plant. The Blackwater processing plant had been closed since 1987, and honestly, most people in town just avoided that whole area year-round. The weird stuff started before we even got inside. When we pulled up in Jake's truck around 9:45 p.m., the first thing I noticed were these stone cairns, those little stacks of rocks, placed all around the perimeter fence. They looked fresh, like someone had been out there recently arranging them in perfect circles. Each stack was exactly the same height, exactly the same distance apart. Carla found red cloth strips tied to the fence, posts in geometric patterns, like trail markers, but not for any trail a person would follow. The patterns didn't make sense for human navigation. Jake had brought a police scanner he used for his volunteer fire department work, and as soon as he turned it on, we started hearing clicking sounds. Not random static, clicking, organized clicking that followed some kind of mathematical pattern. Too organized to be natural interference. The security briefing packet mentioned that other teams had quit, but it didn't explain why all the previous logs had the same entry every year. October 30th. All personnel evacuated. Do not return until November 18. When we walked the perimeter, Carla pointed out handprints on the main building's windows. 4-fingered prints with palms that were way too long and narrow. The prints were about 8 feet off the ground, which meant whatever made them was either really tall or could reach higher than it should have been able to. At 10:47 p.m., we heard something large moving through the equipment yard, metal scraping against concrete, heavy footsteps that echoed wrong. But when we checked the motion sensors, the monitors showed absolutely nothing. The clicking sounds got more frequent after 11 p.m., and they started coming from multiple directions. It sounded like something was calling to others of its kind, using a language made of patterns and rhythms instead of words. Jake discovered that the razor wire on the fence had been cut in several places, with the metal bent outward from the inside, like something had been trying to get out rather than in. Through the security cameras, we spotted a pale figure moving between the buildings. Its gait was wrong, too fluid, with joints that bent in ways that hurt to look at. The thing was tall and gaunt, with arms that hung past its knees and a head that tilted at an unnatural angle, like a bird studying something interesting. Every light it passed under would flicker and dim, like its presence was interfering with the electrical systems. It seemed to be studying the buildings methodically, touching walls and equipment like it was mapping the territory, learning the layout for some purpose we couldn't understand. That's when our radios started picking up sounds that mimicked our voices. Jake, Carla, Tom. But with the wrong emotional inflection, like something had heard us speak but didn't understand what emotions were supposed to sound like. When I tried to call for backup on my cell phone, the creature stopped moving and turned toward our location from over 200 yards away. Its skin looked gray and waxy, stretched too tight over bones that seemed to be in the wrong places. At 11:45, we realized we weren't just witnessing some unknown animal. This thing was intelligent, and it was hunting us. At midnight exactly, the creature began systematically cutting our power lines, plunging sections of the plant into complete darkness. Our emergency lighting revealed that there were now multiple entities, at least 3 more pale figures moving with coordinated purpose through the facility. Jake tried to reach his truck, but found our tires slashed and strange symbols carved into the metal with surgical precision. The entities started using our own voices to call to each other, creating an echo chamber of distorted human speech that made it impossible to tell which direction the real threats were coming from. Carla realized these things weren't random monsters, they were territorial, protecting what they considered their domain from human intruders. The creatures began herding us toward the main processing building, blocking exit routes with systematic precision that spoke of intelligence and planning. Inside the building, I found more stone cairns arranged around what looked like a nest made from scavenged materials, pieces of old security uniforms, electronics, personal items arranged in ritual patterns. Jake discovered a hidden room filled with belongings from previous security teams, all organized by type like some kind of primitive museum. The creatures had been living in the abandoned plant for decades, collecting objects and studying human technology. They weren't just hunting us, they were studying us, learning human behavior through direct observation. One of the entities started wearing pieces of previous security uniforms, attempting to mimic human appearance, but getting all the details wrong. The badge was upside down, the shirt was backwards, the hat sat at an impossible angle. When Carla got separated, we found her surrounded by the creatures, who were testing her reactions to different stimuli, in Team Mile. Sounds, lights, movements, like researchers conducting behavioral experiments. These things could perfectly mimic any sound they'd heard, using our own radio chatter against us. They demonstrated problem-solving abilities, working together to bypass security measures they'd apparently studied for years. We weren't random victims. We were specimens being studied by something that viewed humans as research subjects. Around 2 a.m., Jake figured out that the entities followed strict territorial boundaries. They wouldn't pursue beyond the plant's property line. Using this knowledge, he created a diversion, leading 2 entities away from Carla while I helped her reach the fence line. The beings adapted their tactics in real time, but we discovered they were vulnerable to sudden loud noises, which seemed to disorient their communication system. Using emergency air horns from the security kit, we managed to create enough confusion to reach the perimeter fence. As we escaped through the cut sections, the creatures gathered at the property line but wouldn't cross the boundary. They watched us leave with obvious intelligence, tilting their heads and making soft clicking sounds like they were discussing our escape, analyzing what they'd learned from the encounter. We reached the road at 5:30 a.m. and called the police. But when investigators arrived at sunrise, they found no evidence of our encounter. No footprints, no symbols, no damaged equipment. The plant was demolished 6 months later after the county declared it a public safety hazard. But I sometimes wonder if those entities just found a new research site deeper in the mountains. I never took another security job. I'm an electrician now, working mostly day shifts in well-populated areas. But sometimes, late at night when I'm working alone, I hear clicking sounds that follow patterns, and I remember those pale figures studying us like we were insects in a jar. I still don't sleep well on Halloween night, and I never will. I'm 31 years old and work as a mail carrier in eastern Kentucky. I've been covering the same rural routes for 8 years now, which means I know pretty much every family scattered across these mountains. Most days, it's just me, my truck, and miles of winding roads that snake between hollows most people have never heard of. I guess that's why Principal Davis called me that morning, October 30th, 2019, when their substitute teacher ended up in the hospital and they needed someone who could handle a classroom full of mountain kids on short notice. I was just finishing my route around 6 a.m. when my phone rang. Davis sounded desperate, explaining that Hollow Creek Elementary was down to 12 students that day and he couldn't find anyone else willing to take the job. "Maria," he said, "you know these families better than any substitute we could bring in from town. These kids trust you." He had a point. I'd been delivering mail to their parents and grandparents for years, watching some of these children grow up from babies to elementary age. Plus, he was offering double pay for what he called a special circumstance day. When I met Davis at the school 20 minutes later, he handed me a manila folder marked October 30th Protocols in red ink. Inside were instructions that made my stomach drop. All windows had to stay covered with the black paper already taped up. No outdoor activities, period. Maintain constant head count every 15 minutes. And strangest of all, there were unmarked bottles of what looked like children's Benadryl labeled as calm medicine if any child became distressed by external sounds. Davis led me to a locked supply cabinet and handed me the key. Inside was a shotgun with a box of shells marked Iron Core, mountain use only. He must have seen the look on my face because he started explaining, his voice shaking slightly. "Every October 30th, he said, something came down from the old Cherokee hunting grounds up the mountain. He called it the hunger, spirits that possessed dying animals during harsh winters, turning them into something that needed human flesh to survive until spring hibernation. The Cherokee used to contain them," Davis said, shouldering his own rifle. "Built their village here specifically for that purpose. When the government forced them out in the 1800s, the containment rituals stopped working as well. We do what we can now." He explained that the school was built over the original Cherokee protection site, with iron reinforcement in the foundation and symbols carved into the basement walls. Then he left me alone with 12 children, promising to return with the men before dark. The moment Davis drove away, the kids started moving with practiced efficiency I'd never seen before. 8-year-old Emma and 10-year-old Marcus began arranging the desks in a perfect circle, while the others gathered specific items from around the classroom: iron scissors, metal rulers, anything containing iron. They moved like they'd done this drill dozens of times. "Miss Maria," Emma said in her soft mountain accent, "today's hiding day. We gotta stay real quiet so the hungry ones don't find us." She said it matter-of-factly, like she was explaining a fire drill. Marcus, whose great-grandmother was Cherokee, started teaching the younger kids traditional songs in what sounded like the old language. "Mima says, these keep the bad spirits confused," he explained. "I tried to maintain normal lesson plans, but it was impossible to ignore the scratching sounds that started around 9 a.m. Long, deliberate scrapes moved across the roof like something was testing how strong the structure was. The children didn't even flinch, they just started singing louder. That's when I found the teacher's hidden journal in the desk drawer. 30 years of October 30th entries, with detailed drawings that made my hands shake. Bears with arms that hung to the ground and human-like hands. Deer with predator teeth and 2 intelligent eyes. Mountain cats stretched to impossible lengths, moving like spiders. The latest entry was from last year. Containment holding, but they're getting stronger. Iron ammunition essential. Cherokee families still helping with barriers. By 11 a.m., whatever was on the roof had found the ventilation system. Sounds echoed through the walls, crying that sounded like children calling for help, but with something wrong in the tone. The kids explained that the creatures could mimic human voices, but never got the emotions quite right. They sound too hungry when they pretend to be sad. Little Jake said. The children refused to eat lunch, saying they needed to stay light in case we had to run to the safe room. Marcus led me to a hidden door behind the supply cabinet that opened onto stairs, leading to a basement room I never knew existed. It was built directly over what looked like an ancient ceremonial chamber, with iron symbols carved into every surface and supplies stocked for a week-long siege. Around 12:30, something hit the main door hard enough to crack the reinforced steel frame. Through a gap in the window covering, I caught sight of what looked like a black bear walking upright, but its arms were too long and its face was too human. It was methodically testing the door handle, learning how human mechanisms worked while making sounds like a lost child calling for its mother. That's when Jake started crying, and immediately every other child covered his mouth. They knew sound would draw attention. Marcus began arranging iron objects in specific patterns while chanting in Cherokee, and I realized these weren't just random mountain kids hiding from monsters. They were descendants of the families who'd been maintaining this containment for generations. The creatures responded to the chanting by becoming more aggressive, apparently recognizing the old magic. At 1 p.m., they began coordinated attacks on multiple entry points. I tried the emergency radio to contact Davis, but all I got was static and what sounded like screaming in the distance. Then a voice came through that sounded exactly like Davis calling for help, but Emma shook her head firmly. "That's not really him, Miss Maria. The voice is too hungry." Around 2 p.m., one of them broke through the roof. I could hear it moving through the ceiling tiles directly above us, and I finally understood why the ammunition was specially marked for mountain use. When the first creature finally crashed through, a mountain cat stretched to cougar size but moving like a spider, I fired the iron core shell directly into its chest. The thing dissolved into black smoke with a scream that sounded almost human. The iron didn't just kill it, it destroyed whatever spirit was possessing the animal, releasing something that felt like relief into the air. More came through the weakened roof after that. Bears with human hands, deer with predator instincts, raccoons working together in ways that defied nature. But the children's chanting grew stronger, and I realized they weren't just hiding. They were performing an exorcism ritual passed down through their families. Davis finally arrived with 5 Cherokee men carrying traditional weapons blessed with iron. They explained that their families had never really left this land, just gone underground, secretly maintaining the containment protocols their ancestors had established. Together, we drove the remaining possessed animals back toward the old hunting grounds while the children completed their purification ritual. The Cherokee elder told me that every few decades, the hunger spirits grow strong enough to break containment, requiring the community to renew the barriers. As the last creature retreated into the mountains, the children finally broke their protection circle and returned to being normal kids, laughing and playing like nothing had happened. I never substitute taught again, but I gained a deep respect for these families and what they've been quietly protecting all these years. Now, when I deliver mail, I help coordinate their annual protection rituals, carrying messages between the Cherokee families who still live scattered through these mountains. Looking back, I understand why Davis was so desperate that morning. It wasn't just about finding a substitute teacher. These kids needed someone they trusted, someone who was already part of their community, someone who could handle the truth about what really happens in these mountains every October 30th. I still work the same mail route, but I take October 30th off now. Some responsibilities are too important to risk, and some knowledge changes you forever. The families know they can count on me, and honestly, that means more than any job ever could. I'm 28 years old now, and I work as a radio technician for a small company that maintains emergency broadcast equipment across West Virginia. Most of the time, it's boring work checking transmitters, replacing old gear, making sure everything stays functional for when the county actually needs it. But back in October of 1987, when I was just starting out as an intern at WMTN radio station, I experienced something that still makes me question what's real and what isn't. I was working the overnight shift on October 30th, 1987, helping our main DJ, Jake Morrison, with equipment checks. Jake had been broadcasting from those mountains for over 20 years, and he'd seen everything: floods, mine collapses, blizzards that cut off entire communities for weeks. Nothing really rattled him. The station was located up on a ridge outside Beckley, in an old building that had been converted from a Forestry Service outpost. Most nights were quiet, just playing music and taking the occasional call from insomniacs or shift workers heading home. That night started normal enough. Jake was doing his usual late-night show, playing classic country and taking requests. I was in the back room monitoring our emergency broadcast equipment, making sure all our backup systems were running properly. Around 9 p.m., that's when everything started going sideways. The first sign something was wrong came through our emergency radio network. Sheriff Coleman's voice crackled through, reporting power outages all across Raleigh County. But these weren't random blackouts, they were following a specific pattern. When I pulled up our county map and started marking the affected areas, I realized they were tracing the old Cherokee Trail system exactly. Every single outage was happening along paths that had been used by Native Americans for hundreds of years before white settlers arrived. Jake switched us over to emergency power when our main grid failed, and that's when the calls started coming in. Betty from Slab Fork called first, her voice shaky, as she told us her grandmother had always warned that October 30th was when Cherokee spirits walked the old paths. Jake tried to laugh it off, but I could hear the uncertainty in his voice. Then Dr. Sarah Chen from Beckley Hospital got on our emergency frequency. She was reporting multiple patients coming in with identical symptoms, temporary paralysis, but only when they tried to leave areas near the traditional Cherokee trails. The patients were all experiencing vivid visions of Native American warriors, and the strange thing was, they were describing the same scenes in exact detail. Around 10 p.m., Tom Bradley called in. He was the Cherokee Nation cultural liaison, and his voice was deadly serious when he explained what was happening. October 30th, 1987, marked exactly 200 years since what he called the Forced March, when Cherokee families had been driven from these mountains at gunpoint. He said every 50 years on this date, the spirits of those who died trying to protect their homeland would return, growing stronger each time. The emergency radio kept crackling with more reports. Fire Chief Martinez said vehicles were stalling all along Route 19 wherever it crossed the old Cherokee Trail system. Engines wouldn't turn over, radios went dead, but as soon as they towed the cars away from the trail areas, everything worked perfectly again. It was like the spirits were physically blocking anyone from using those ancient paths. Maria Santos called in crying, trapped in her car on Coalfield Road. She described people in old-fashioned clothing surrounding her vehicle, not threatening her, but pointing toward town and shaking their heads, refusing to let her drive on what had once been Cherokee land. Her voice was terrified but confused, like she couldn't understand why these figures seemed so real. That's when Tom Bradley started sharing the real history, the parts that never made it into our school textbooks. He explained that what happened in 1787 wasn't just forced removal. It was systematic genocide. White settlers had deliberately destroyed Cherokee sacred sites and burial grounds, not just to take the land, but to break the spiritual connection between the Cherokee people and their ancestral home. Elder Ruth Sizemore, 89 years old and Cherokee Nation, called in around 11 p.m. Her voice was calm, but filled with something that sounded like relief. She said her grandmother had told her the spirits would return when enough Cherokee people lived to properly welcome them home. After 200 years of rebuilding their culture, the ancestors were finally strong enough to reclaim what had been stolen. Dr. Chen got back on the radio with an update that made my skin crawl. The patients weren't hallucinating, they were receiving actual historical memories from Cherokee spirits. The visions matched oral histories that had been passed down through Cherokee families but were never documented by white historians. People were seeing mass graves, destroyed villages, sacred sites that had been deliberately desecrated and then built over. Just after midnight on Halloween, reports started coming in of traditional Cherokee dwellings appearing along the trail system buildings that shouldn't exist, constructed in the old style and glowing with a faint light that shouldn't be possible. Sheriff's deputies who got close enough said they could hear voices speaking in Cherokee, singing songs that sounded both mournful and angry. One caller, Morrison, was sobbing as he described seeing his own ancestor from 1787, Samuel Morrison, who had apparently driven Cherokee families from their homes at gunpoint. The spirit of Chief Running Bear was showing him what his family had done, how they'd built their farm directly on top of a Cherokee graveyard. The man was experiencing every detail of his ancestors' crimes, feeling the weight of 200 years of buried guilt. But here's the thing that still gives me chills. Tom Bradley explained that the spirits weren't there for revenge. They were there to teach, to make sure the truth finally came out. They wanted acknowledgement of what had been done, protection for the remaining sacred sites, and proper burial for ancestors whose graves had been destroyed and forgotten. Around 1 a.m., Ruth Sizemore called in from the old Cherokee Council ground with about 50 tribal members. They were performing a welcome home ceremony, singing traditional songs that had been preserved through 2 centuries of oppression. As they sang, she said the spirits were becoming visible, hundreds of Cherokee ancestors gathering in the sacred circle, finally able to return to the place they'd died protecting. Dr. Chen reported that as the ceremonies progressed, her patients were becoming peaceful. The shared visions were shifting from trauma to healing, and the temporary paralysis was fading. People were being released from whatever force had been holding them on the trails. Morrison called back, his voice different now. Chief Running Bear's spirit had forgiven his family, but asked them to help protect Cherokee burial sites that were still being discovered and developed. The forgiveness wasn't conditional, it was offered freely, but with the understanding that acknowledgement and protection would follow. By 6 a.m. on Halloween morning, the phenomena were subsiding. Power was being restored across the county, vehicles were starting normally, and the emergency radio traffic was returning to normal levels. Jake signed off that morning by saying we'd all learned something about the real history of our mountains, history that had been deliberately hidden for 2 centuries. The aftermath was immediate and lasting. Raleigh County established the Cherokee Heritage Protection Act within 6 months, preserving all traditional sites and funding proper burial for unmarked graves that kept being discovered during construction projects. 5 surrounding counties passed similar legislation, and WMTN became the first radio station in the region to broadcast weekly Cherokee language and culture programs. I still work in emergency broadcasting, and I've never experienced anything like that night again. But every October 30th, I make sure to drive the long way around any routes that follow the old Cherokee Trail system. Some things are too powerful to test twice, and some history is too important to ignore. That night taught me that the dead don't always rest quietly, especially when their stories have been buried along with their bones. To this day, I keep Cherokee Nation contact numbers in my emergency radio kit, because if something like that ever happens again, I want to make sure the right people are involved from the beginning. The spirits earned their peace that night, but it came with a responsibility that those of us who witnessed it can never forget. I'm 62 years old, and I burned down my childhood home 3 nights ago. I'm sitting here in the Beckley Public Library, typing this, because I need people to know what really happened, even though nobody's going to believe me. My name's Dorothy, and up until this week, I was just a retired postal worker trying to settle my mama's estate before the county took the property for back taxes. The house sits in Copper Hollow, about 40 minutes outside of town on a dirt road that winds between the mountains like a snake. Mama died 2 years back, and I'd been putting off dealing with her things because, honestly, going back to that place always made my skin crawl. But the county was breathing down my neck, threatening to seize the property if I didn't clean it out by November 1st. So Halloween Day, I loaded up my Honda with some boxes and drove out there with Daddy's old Polaroid camera to document everything for the insurance. I should probably mention that I've always had a complicated relationship with that house. Growing up there in the 60s, I was never really alone, but I could never explain to the adults who my playmates were. Mama would find me having elaborate tea parties in the basement with what she called imaginary friends, except these friends left real crumbs on real plates. I told her about the children who lived in the between times and only came out when the light was wrong, but she just figured I had an overactive imagination. These weren't normal imaginary friends, though. They taught me games that involved arranging my toys in specific patterns and singing songs in words that definitely weren't English. When I was 8, I drew pictures of them for show and tell Calment. Pale children with solid black eyes, wearing clothes that looked like they came from old photographs. My teacher, Mrs. Henderson, kept those drawings and called Mama in for a conference about my disturbing imagination. The weird thing is, I stopped seeing them after my 10th birthday, right around the time we moved to town so I could go to the bigger high school. I was relieved to leave that house behind, but I never forgot the promise I'd made to them, that someday I'd come back to finish whatever game we'd been playing. So there I was, on Halloween afternoon, pulling into the overgrown driveway with fog rolling between the mountains like something was trying to hide the hollow from view. The October air was gray and cold, and as soon as I stepped out of the car, I felt like I was 7 years old again. The small and scared in a place that seemed too big and too quiet. The house looked exactly the same as when we'd left it all those years ago, just more weathered. Paint peeling off the clapboard siding, front porch sagging on one side, windows dark as empty eye sockets. I grabbed Daddy's camera and headed inside, planning to systematically photograph each room for the insurance paperwork. That's when things started getting strange. The camera kept misfiring, double exposing images in ways that didn't make any sense. I'd point it at an empty corner and somehow capture what looked like 2 different rooms superimposed on each other. The flash would go off when I wasn't pressing the button, and sometimes it wouldn't work at all, even with fresh batteries. But the worst part was the basement. That old playroom where I'd spent so much time as a child felt wrong the moment I opened the door. The air down there was too warm, and it tasted metallic, like sucking on a penny. All my old toys were exactly where I'd left them 60 years ago, but they were arranged in patterns I didn't remember making, geometric shapes and spirals that hurt my eyes to look at directly. When I tried to photograph the basement, the flash illuminated something that made my blood turn to ice water. There were handprints pressed into the stone walls. Small hands, like children had been leaning against the foundation. But the prints were dark and seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. That's when I heard the whispering. It started soft, like wind through the floorboards. But gradually I could make out my name being called. Dorothy, in voices that sounded young and far away. Dorothy, you came back. When I called out in response, only my own voice echoed back, but it sounded higher and younger, like I was 7 years old again. I started snapping pictures frantically, trying to document whatever was happening, but every photo that came out of that camera was wrong. They showed me interacting with people who weren't there, handing invisible figures, objects, playing games with empty air. In the background of every single photo, I could make out shapes that looked like children, but their eyes were solid black holes that seemed to move when I wasn't looking directly at them. The timestamp on the photos showed I'd been down there for 8 hours, but I could swear I'd only been in the basement for 20 minutes. Even stranger, the light coming through the small basement windows never changed in any of the pictures, like the sun had just stopped moving across the sky. But the photo that really broke my mind was the last one I took before running upstairs. It showed me as a child, maybe 7 or 8 years old, standing in that same basement with the same dark-eyed children I'd been playing with all those years ago. And in the photo, little Dorothy was smiling like she belonged with them, like she was finally home. When I looked at that picture, the memory came flooding back. The promise I'd made when I was 10 wasn't that I'd come back to visit. It was that I'd come back to stay, to finish a ritual they'd been trying to complete for decades. These children had been waiting in that house since before my family had even built it, trapped in some space between life and death, playing an eternal game that required one more player to complete the circle. I ran upstairs and out to my car, but when I got there, I found something in my coat pocket that made my knees give out. It was the same box of matches I'd seen myself handing to my child self in that impossible photograph, along with my own baby teeth that I'd lost 60 years ago. The photos were changing as I sat there in my car. Now they showed the house burning with all of us. Me, my child self, and those dark-eyed children, dancing around the flames like it was some kind of celebration. That's when I understood what was really happening. Time doesn't work normally in that house. Past and present exist simultaneously, and those children had been waiting over a century for another child to complete their ritual. They saw me as the 7-year-old Dorothy who had made that promise, even though I was now 62 years old. The photos showed me aging backwards during my visit, becoming the child who had made the original promise while my adult self watched helplessly. I drove straight to the patented aging backwards next hardware store in town and bought 5 gallons of gasoline. I wasn't going to let those children trap another family the way they'd tried to trap me. That night, I went back to the house and soaked every room, every wall, every piece of furniture. When I struck the match, the whole place went up like it had been waiting decades to burn. Before I left, I dug around in what used to be Mama's garden and found something that confirmed my worst fears. There were stone foundations underneath our house, the remains of an older building. Mama had never told me, but I'd done some research at the library since that night. Our house was built on the site of the old Copper Hollow School. In October 1918, during the Spanish flu pandemic, that one-room schoolhouse had been turned into a quarantine center for sick children. 17 kids between ages 6 and 12 were isolated there with their teacher, Miss Catherine Dalton. The community was so afraid of the flu spreading that they boarded up the windows and doors, trapping everyone inside until the sickness passed. But according to the records I found, the flu wasn't the only thing killing people that October. There were reports of children losing their minds before they died, talking to shadows and drawing symbols that the adults couldn't understand. When the building was finally opened in November, all 18 bodies were found arranged in a perfect circle in the basement, their eyes completely black. The families tried to burn the building, but it wouldn't catch fire. So they tore it down, salted the earth, and eventually sold the land cheap to anyone willing to build there. Every family who lived on that spot reported the same thing. Children seeing playmates who weren't there. Those children in the basement weren't my imaginary friends. They were the spirits of the kids who died in that school, trapped for over a century, waiting for someone to complete whatever ritual they'd started in their ID, the final moments. They'd been calling to the children of every family who lived there, but I was the first one who'd actually made the promise to come back. By burning the house, I broke the circle, but I realize now that it cost me something I can't get back. Part of me is still there in that basement, still 7 years old, still playing games with children who died before my grandparents were born. I can feel them sometimes, especially at night, whispering my name and asking when I'm coming home. The land will be sold again eventually. Some family will build a new house there because the price is right and the mountains are beautiful. When they do, I hope they find this account. I hope they understand that some promises echo across generations, and some games are never meant to be finished. I don't sleep much anymore. Every time I close my eyes, I see those photographs changing, showing me dancing with dead children around the flames of a house that burned down, but somehow still stands in whatever space exists between then and now. If you're reading this and you're thinking about buying land in Copper Hollow, don't. Some places are meant to stay empty. Some games are meant to stay unfinished, and some promises should never be made, even by children who don't understand what they're agreeing to. I still have those photographs. They're the only proof of what really happened, and they're still changing. Right now, as I type this, They show an empty basement filled with toys arranged in perfect circles, waiting for the next child to find them and start the game all over again. I'm 38 years old, and I manage the IGA grocery store over in Murphy, North Carolina. Been doing that for about 6 years now, ever since my daughter Emma was diagnosed with leukemia and we needed the health insurance. The treatments were expensive, even with coverage, and my wife Sarah had to cut back her hours at the bank to drive Emma to Charlotte for chemo twice a week. Money was always tight, but we made it work. That's how I ended up taking a security job on Halloween night 2019 at the old Blackwater Mining Company. The place had been shut down since 1987, but the company still owned the property and needed guards to keep vandals out. They offered triple overtime for Halloween night. ILOD, something about insurance requirements. I figured one night of easy money would help with Emma's medical bills, so I signed up along with 2 other folks. Carla, who cooked at Murphy's Diner and was behind on her rent, and this young guy Tom, who delivered pizzas and was saving for trade school. None of us had worked security before, but they said it was simple. Just walk around every hour, check that the gates were locked, and make sure nobody was spray painting the buildings or stealing copper wire. The mining company had tried hiring professional security firms, but apparently they couldn't keep guards for more than one Halloween night. Something about the locals being superstitious. I should have paid more attention to that detail. The Blackwater mine had a reputation around here. 12 men died in a methane explosion on Halloween night. 1,987. My grandfather actually worked there until 1985. Quit 2 years before the accident because he said something felt wrong about the place. He used to tell me that the mining company had dug right through an old Cherokee burial ground and that the Cherokee families had warned them it would bring trouble. But the company needed the coal, so they kept digging. Granddad always said the 1,987 explosion wasn't really an accident. He claimed the Cherokee spirits had gotten angry about their ancestors being disturbed, and they possessed the dead miners to get revenge. Every Halloween since then, people reported seeing ghostly figures walking around the property, miners in full gear, carrying lunch pails and checking equipment like they were still trying to finish their shift. I'd always figured those were just local ghost stories, the kind every small mountain town has. But the mining company was paying us $45 an hour for Halloween night, which was more than I made in a day at the grocery store. So at 9:30 p.m., I drove my truck up the winding mountain road to meet Carla and Tom at the main gate. The Blackwater property was bigger than I'd expected, maybe 40 acres of rusted equipment, abandoned buildings, and the sealed mine entrance itself. Corporate had given us 3 radios, a set of keys, and a clipboard with checkpoints to hit every hour. The main office still had power, with a break room where we could warm up coffee and fill out our reports. Everything seemed normal until we walked into that break room around 10:15 p.m. 12 mining helmets were arranged in a perfect circle on the table. Not stacked up or stored away, arranged deliberately, like someone had been planning a meeting. The helmets looked old, from the 1,980 seconds, with that faded yellow plastic and the little battery-powered lights on the front. Those weren't here when I did the afternoon inspection, Tom said, checking his paperwork. He'd been there at 4 p.m. to pick up the keys and hadn't mentioned any helmets. Carla picked up one of the helmets and immediately set it back down. "It's ice cold," she said, rubbing her hands together, like it's been sitting in a freezer. I checked the windows and doors, all locked from the inside. The day shift security guard had left at 6 p.m., and we were the first people on the property since then. But somehow, 12 helmets had been arranged in a circle on that table. At 11:15, we heard the mine whistle blow 3 times. The sound echoed across the mountains, deep and mournful, like a train horn but longer. It was the old signal that used to call workers to the night shift. I knew this because my grandfather had told me about it. 3 long blasts meant it was time to go underground. But the whistle had been disconnected from power for 30 years. "Y'all heard that, right?" Carla asked, and we all nodded. The sound had been clear as day, coming from the direction of the sealed mine entrance. Tom was flipping through the security logbook, reading entries from previous years. His face got pale as he read. "Listen to this," he said. "October 31st, 2018. All guards evacuated at 2:47 a.m. Do not return until November 1st. October 31st, 2017. Supernatural activity confirmed. Guards removed from property for safety. October 31st, 2016. Equipment malfunction. Staff relocated. Property secure. Every single Halloween, entry ended the same way. The guards had left before dawn. We decided to do our first patrol together, just to be safe. The mining property was laid out in a rough circle around the old shaft entrance, with equipment sheds, the company store, and a maintenance building scattered around the perimeter. Our flashlights cut through the darkness as we walked the gravel paths between buildings. That's when we found the boot prints. Fresh prints in the coal dust, leading from the sealed mine entrance toward the equipment sheds. They were from heavy work boots, the kind miners wore, with deep treads that left clear impressions. The prints were still sharp, like they'd been made within the last hour, but the mine entrance had been sealed with concrete in 1987. There was no way for anyone to come out of there. Maybe it's kids, Tom suggested, but his voice wasn't convincing. Halloween prank or something. The boot prints were too big to be from kids, and they followed the Boddersons, the exact path that miners would have taken from the shaft to the equipment storage. Like muscle memory, even after death. As we followed the prints toward the first shed, I started hearing machinery running underground. A deep rumbling sound, like conveyor belts and excavators working way down in the earth. But the mine had been permanently sealed for over 30 years. Carla's radio crackled to life. "Night shift, report to Station 7, came a voice through the static. "We're behind quota and need to make up time before morning." We all stopped walking. The voice sounded tired but determined, like a foreman trying to motivate his crew. But there wasn't supposed to be anyone else on the property. "Station 7, this is Jimmy," came another voice. "Heading down to the lower tunnels now. Think we can clear that seam before dawn?" Carla tried to respond, but our radios only picked up more voices, men discussing mining quotas and shift schedules, talking about equipment repairs and safety checks, all business as usual, like they were still alive and working. The temperature around us dropped 20 degrees in about 30 seconds. I could see my breath, even though it had been a warm October night when we arrived. The air got thick and heavy, like it does before a thunderstorm, and I could smell something metallic and damp, like old mining equipment mixed with underground water. "Jake," came a voice from Carla's radio, and my blood went cold. "Jake, you out there, boy?" I recognized that voice. It was Raymond Hutchins, my grandfather's work partner, who died in the 1987 explosion. Granddad had told me stories about Raymond, how he always called roll for the night crew, how he looked out for the younger miners. "Jake, if that's Danny's grandson up there, you better listen good." Raymond's voice continued. "We got work to finish, and we don't need any interference from corporate." At 11:45, we saw our first miner. He was walking slowly toward the sealed mine entrance, wearing full gear, helmet, work clothes, steel-toed boots, carrying a metal lunch pail. The light on his helmet cut through the darkness as he moved, but there was something wrong with the way he walked. Too smooth, like he was gliding just above the ground. We were maybe 50 yards away, hidden behind one of the equipment sheds, but I could see him clearly in the moonlight. He looked solid, real, like any other person. But when he reached the concrete barrier that sealed the mine entrance, he just walked right through it and disappeared. More lights appeared. First 2, then 5, then 12 helmet lights coming from impossible directions, through solid rock, through sealed concrete, through the earth itself. The ghostly miners emerged from the mountain like they were walking through water, their lights swaying as they moved toward their workstations. At midnight, exactly, all 12 miners had assembled near the entrance. They moved with purpose, checking equipment that hadn't run in decades, preparing for a shift that death had interrupted 37 years ago. Tom tried to radio for backup, but our communications were completely jammed now. The dead miners' voices filled every frequency, broadcasting mining reports and safety updates from Halloween night 1987, their last shift before the explosion killed them all. We backed toward the main office, but the spirits had other plans. They began systematically cutting power lines and disabling our equipment, trapping us on the property. Our truck wouldn't start. The engine turned over but died immediately, like something was choking off the fuel supply. "They're not just ghosts," Carla whispered as we watched the miners work. "They're hunting us." She was right. The spirits moved through the property with military precision, searching every building and shed like they were tracking coal veins. They knew exactly where we were and where we might try to hide. I found something painted on the office wall that we'd missed earlier, a Cherokee blessing in faded paint, probably left by a previous security guard who understood what we were dealing with. The symbols looked old, but the paint was recent, maybe from last year's Halloween shift. The miners could manipulate the physical world. They opened doors, threw tools, and created barriers to herd us toward specific areas. They wanted something from us, but I couldn't figure out what. Then we heard the mine elevator running. The mechanical grinding of cables and gears echoed from deep underground, bringing up more shifts of dead workers. Not just the 12 from 1987, but miners who died in various accidents over the decades, cave-ins, equipment failures, gas leaks that the company had covered up. By 1 a.m., there were maybe 30 ghostly figures on the property. The spirits started using heavy equipment as weapons, operating bulldozers and excavators with impossible skill. The machines moved on their own, headlights cutting through the darkness as dead miners drove them in formation around the property. During the chaos, we got separated. Carla had been herded into the old company store, while Tom and I tried to find another way off the mountain. We could hear her screaming inside the building, but when we got there, the voices interrogating her weren't quite human anymore. "Why are you disrupting the work schedule?" came the question, repeated over and over. "Why won't you let us finish our shift?" We found her tied up with mining cable, surrounded by translucent figures in work gear. The spirits weren't angry, they were frustrated, like employees dealing with management interference. That's when I understood. The dead miners explained through Carla that they'd been trying to complete their final shift for 37 years. Every Halloween, they returned to finish the work that death had interrupted. But every Halloween, security guards interfered with their schedule, forcing them to start over and extending their spiritual imprisonment. We weren't random victims. We represented the company management that had ignored safety warnings and caused their deaths in the first place. "Your grandfather's here," Raymond's spirit told me, and I saw him, Granddad's work partner from 40 years ago, still wearing his mining gear. He says, "You can help us finish what we started." The spirits showed us visions of Halloween night 1987. Corporate executives had known about the methane leak for weeks, but ordered the miners to keep working anyway. The night shift crew had discovered that the main coal seam ran directly through a Cherokee burial ground, and they'd been planning to seal it off before the gas killed them. They'd planted explosives to properly close the burial ground and protect both the Cherokee ancestors and future miners. But the methane explosion happened before they could finish the job. "We're not evil," Raymond explained. "We're workers seeking justice. Help us complete our final shift, and we can finally rest." The Cherokee burial ground was still down there, disturbed and unprotected. The miners needed to properly seal it to free both their own spirits and the Cherokee ancestors they'd accidentally violated. I looked at Carla and Tom. We were maintenance workers and cooks and delivery drivers, not mining engineers. But these spirits had been trapped for nearly 4 decades because of corporate greed, and maybe we could help them find peace. We agreed to help. Led by my grandfather's spirit, we accessed the sealed areas the miners needed to complete their work. They guided us to hidden explosives they'd placed in 1987, still stable after all these years, positioned to safely seal the burial ground without causing another methane explosion. Carla used her experience with cooking chemistry to help mix compounds that would detonate the charges safely. Tom figured out how to rewire the detonation controls using knowledge from his pizza delivery GPS systems. And I provided the spiritual connection, translating between my grandfather's spirit and the Cherokee ancestors who needed their burial ground protected. The work took hours. The spirits were patient teachers, showing us exactly what needed to be done. They weren't interested in revenge anymore, just in completing the job they'd started 40 years ago. At 4 a.m., we successfully detonated the charges. The explosion was controlled and precise, sealing the Cherokee burial ground permanently while allowing both groups of spirits to finally rest. The miners thanked us by shielding us from debris and gas with their ghostly forms, protecting us like they'd always protected each other underground. As dawn approached, the spirits began fading. One by one, they removed their helmets and set down their tools, finally able to clock out from their eternal shift. Raymond shook my hand before he disappeared. "Tell your grandfather we finished the job," he said. "The mountain's safe now." We stayed until 6 a.m. to file our report, but corporate never called us back. A week later, we heard that the mining company had donated the entire property to the Cherokee Nation, ending the need for security forever. I still work at the IGA, and Emma's doing better now. She's been cancer-free for 2 years. But I think about that Halloween night often, especially when I'm stocking shelves late in the evening and the store gets quiet. Those weren't evil spirits. They were just working men who died because corporate executives put profits over safety. They'd been trapped for decades, unable to rest until they could complete the job they'd started and make things right with the Cherokee families they'd accidentally wronged. Sometimes the scariest things aren't monsters or demons. Sometimes they're just people who died with unfinished business, trying to fix the mistakes that powerful men forced them to make. I never took another security job. Some overtime isn't worth it.